In this research project, I wanted to determine how effective technology was at engaging readers. I wanted to determine the effect that nonfiction text had on a reader's motivation, and I also wanted to compare technology and nonfiction to determine which one had a higher motivating effect on the students. While conducting my literature review, 3 themes became apparent while researching technology and motivation. Tablets and computers allowed for differentiation. Students could work at their individual level, and others could not tell if students were at a higher or lower level. Technology also enabled students to see themselves as readers. Tablets allowed for repeated reading, which led to feelings of success. Students were also practicing their 21st century skills, which are needed to be successful in our information age. 3 themes were also apparent while studying nonfiction text. Nonfiction that is tied to student interest is very motivating. Young kids overwhelmingly chose nonfiction over fiction in many studies. Students also were motivated by nonfiction because they tend to have some background knowledge that they can bring to discussions. Lastly, nonfiction has purpose because it makes up a majority of what adults read, and this real-world application is engaging. This project was conducted on my 22 kindergarten students. I focused on the 5 students in my lowest reading group. These students were chosen because of convenient sampling and because they were struggling with basic reading skills. All students were given a pseudonym. Keshia is a 6-year-old student who is homeless. She lived with her mother, father, and sister in her grandmother's home along with 4 other family members. She doesn't have very much family support, but her interests include princesses and using iPads. Sam is a 5-year-old student who lives with his mother, father, and sister. He comes from a stable home and he practices reading skills daily. He loves animals and loves to learn about dinosaurs. Sarah is a 5-year-old student who lives with her mother, father, 2 sisters, 2 stepsisters, and a stepbrother. The family has a history of learning disabilities and she does not have very much home support. Sarah loves SpongeBob and singing. Valentina is a 5-year-old student who lives with her mother, father, and sister. She does not have much home support with her learning tasks. Her interests include princesses and dress up. Ayana is a 5-year-old student who lives with her father, stepmother, brother, new baby sister, and 3 other family friends. She is in a custody battle with her biological mother and has begun visitations recently. She loves princesses and scary books. I created an affective factor assessment based off of the Garfield assessment, but then I added my own specific questions relating to this research project. I created an observation checklist to monitor what choices students were making. I then collected data about what choices students were making in the library, and the last thing was I collected data about my classroom blog and coded which posts were about nonfiction text, which ones were about technology, and which ones had a different topic. I gave out the pre-affective factor assessment on April 15th. I was collecting data from April 18th to April 29th, and I collected my post-affective factor assessment data on May 4th. This research project was conducted at a rural school in the Mid-Willamette Valley in Oregon, and this was at a Title I school where many of the students are living in poverty. My first finding was that iPads are very motivating for students, and that relates to my first question about how effective are iPads at motivating students to read. And I discovered using my pre and post affective factor assessment that iPads were motivating. The students were all very highly motivated by them, and they chose the green smiley face on their assessment. It was interesting that 3 of my students ended up picking a lower score for how they felt about reading on the iPad at the conclusion of my data, and I concluded that this was because by the end of the year, students are kind of tired of the choices that they've been given all year long, and a lot of them do find a little bit less motivating by the end of the year. My second question during my research was I wanted to compare the effectiveness of iPads and nonfiction text to how motivating they were to students. So this next figure was the biggest standout to me throughout this whole research project. I compared the number of days students chose iPads and how many days students chose to read nonfiction text during their literacy choices. And the numbers were striking. Every student chose to do iPads most days besides two students, but they all chose iPads over nonfiction text, and they were choosing iPads more often they were doing nonfiction. So I concluded that iPads were more motivating than reading nonfiction text. My next finding was that students are motivated to read nonfiction text about animals, and I used a couple of questions from my affective factor assessment, and I had asked students what kinds of nonfiction they like to read, and almost all students responded with some sort of an animal book, and they all wanted me to buy more books about animals. My third finding was that many students prefer to read nonfiction text, but most check out fiction from our school library. And it was in my data, 3 out of 5 students at the end of my research wanted to read nonfiction over fiction. But when we were going to the library, 4 out of the 5 were picking fiction books. And I attributed this to the way that my school introduces checking out to my students. And they always start in the fiction room, and they don't let the kindergarten students check out nonfiction books until much later in the year when they have solidified their ability to check out books. And so I attributed this to that. And the last finding was that I was not expressing the importance of nonfiction text to the students and families in my classroom. After really reflecting on my own practice and looking at the data I collected from my classroom library and from my blog, I realized that I really was not focusing on the importance of nonfiction text. In my blog, I do almost daily blog posts for my families, and 2 over the last 6 weeks had to deal with nonfiction text, which is not as high of a ratio as I'd wanted. And also that when I was analyzing the books in my classroom, I definitely had a higher ratio of fiction to nonfiction. I had about 4 to 3, I would say, fiction and nonfiction. My biggest recommendation after conducting this research project was that teachers should teach using iPads and technology. They were found to be so highly motivating to my students, and they are, for students of all ages, very motivating and engaging because they allow students to feel like they can connect their 21st century skills, and they are practicing and it looks the same for everyone, so it allows differentiation, allows success. My second recommendation is that teachers find their own students' interests to know what nonfiction to read. It was found that nonfiction was engaging for students and motivating to them, but teachers need to know what nonfiction motivates their own students so that they can make the most out of their motivation. Secondly, it is important to make sure that students know the importance of reading nonfiction text. And one thing is to emphasize it using all forms of communication that teachers have with their families in their classroom. For me, that is including blogs and emails. And the last thing is that teachers should display all of their nonfiction text so that students have access to it all year. I know that I keep many nonfiction books up in a way within themes, and so students have access. It is important to leave it out all year long.